Well, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Furhana Husani. I am the Director of Programs and Climate Initiatives at Waterfront Alliance. Waterfront Alliance is a US-based nonprofit organization with a growing alliance of more than 1,100 partners that focuses on environmental and economic development and bringing about real change to shorelines, waterfronts, and coastlines across the nation and in the New York, New Jersey region. For Climate Week, the Waterfront Alliance will be centering critical conversations around climate resilience issues facing New York City through a series of webinars, roundtable discussions, exhibits, panels, and coastal cleanups. We welcome you to visit our website to learn more about our events this week. I am very excited to be having this conversation with these panelists today. Our webinar today is From Risk to Resilience, Tackling Basement Flooding Through Equity and Reform. And this webinar will explore basement flooding as an impact that has complicated solutions and has injured communities. Our goal today is to discuss opportunities for policy reform and for funding. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our panelists today, really encompassing the entire sort of ecosystem around basements and basement apartments. Happy to start with Jovan Ellis. Jovan has been with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods since 2018. Initially, they served as a program associate, providing financial and housing support to New York residents and collaborating with partners to advocate for housing opportunities and eco-awareness. They also communicated the organization's programs and promoted emotional and technical assistance. Jovan's most recent role at the company is as a help desk program manager. Jovan, very excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Ryan Chavez is a director of small home programs at Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation. In this role, he's led the city's first ever pilot program to convert basements into legal rental apartments. Prior to this, he worked for several years as a community-based planner focused on issues of industrial retention, climate resilience, and renewable energy development. Ryan holds an MS in City and Regional Planning from Pratt Institute. Welcome, Ryan.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Sylvia Morse is a lifelong New Yorker who has focused her work on community planning, the solidarity economy, and housing justice. She is currently the Director of Research and Policy at Pratt Center for Community Development, where she supports community-led housing policy initiatives, including scaling community land trusts and safely legalizing basement apartments with the BASE Coalition. Previously, she worked on growing worker cooperatives at Center for Family Life in Sunset Park, on Superstorm Sandy housing recovery at New York City OMB, and on advancing supportive housing at CSH. She has a master in urban planning from CUNY Hunter. Sylvia, very excited to have you here.
Great to be here with you all. Thank you.
Great. I'd love to now jump into the conversation with our panelists. Would love to start by exploring basement flooding. Would love to sort of set the context to learn a little bit more about, particular communities that are most affected by basement flooding and why they are disproportionately vulnerable. Jovan, would love to sort of hear from you about what are some of the lived experiences of tenants and homeowners.
Absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity. Hi, everyone. So I would like to begin by, for those that may live in New York their whole life or just recently moved here, through this work, I have discovered that regardless where you are within the five boroughs, that all communities are at risk of basement floodings. Regardless if you are on the water or not, New York City is now a coastal community. And due to this, we have seen a large increase of flooding due to ongoing hurricanes, increased rainfall, as well as other properties resiliency measures. And with that being said, basements are typically the target points of flooding just due to lack of structural measures such as drainage, sump pumps, or even where you are within the community could be more at risk of flooding. Another thing that I like to highlight regarding basement flooding, more than this being a place where people live, it's also where people store their valuables. So it's a crucial component that even if your basement is not used for living, basement is still a part where people store their boilers, their pictures, their valuables, and where they create housing as well. So as we discover and we go through this conversation, I just want to highlight that the impact of flooding can really impact all properties. I have some numbers that I like to share because a few inches of rain could cost up to $25,000 of damage to our home. And even if you live 2 miles away from a coast or the water, you can still be at risk of coastal flooding. 1 in 4 homes, and I see there's over 100 people here. So just 1 in 4 homes with a 30-year mortgage will be impacted by flooding. And just speaking some recent occurrences, just this summer, New York has experienced at least three flash floods. On July 14th, Central Park experienced 2.07 inches of water, rain flood in just an hour. On July 30th, up to 5 inches of water was experienced in New York City. And focusing on our key demographic is where I live in Bayside, Queens, where on July 31st, Bayside received 6.35 6.35 inches of rain in just 2 to 3 hours. And in all of July, it received 7 inches of rain just in July alone. And comparing that to the summer of 2024, just last year, the whole summer, Bayside only received 7 inches of rain. And that's the same amount that Bayside received in just 1 month this year. So as we go through this conversation, we do see that there's a need in all communities, regardless if you have basements or you're by the water, that is impacted by flooding for one reason or another. And this is a perfect way to let people know that this information is important, how to be proactive in this in education, and how to lean towards those in this room so you can learn more.
Thanks so much for sharing, Jovan. Sylvia, would love to hear from you and your perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to just build on that. Thank you, Jovan, for grounding us in that. And I think, we understand that the whole city has to adapt to or is dealing with climate change and evolving risk. I think the issue specific to basement apartments in New York City is that the majority of these homes are unregulated. And because of that, it's hard for us to always know from a sort of data perspective where these always are. But Pratt Center has worked with the Base Coalition over the years, including through our first kind of groundbreaking report on this issue in 2008 and again in 2021 to try to identify where some of these unregulated homes might be. And we found that they're concentrated in community districts where there are majority people of color, where rent burdens are higher, where poverty rates are higher than citywide. And this is because we have a housing crisis that affects everyone, but first and foremost affects low-income people, people who face barriers to accessing the traditional housing market and end up relying on these unregulated spaces for their housing. And this also includes low and moderate income homeowners who are at risk of displacement and are relying on these units to support their housing as well, often with people they know in their communities. And so while we all need to need a system-wide approach, an infrastructure-wide approach to addressing the risk of flooding, there are unique issues facing basement residents that can be addressed by taking them out of this gray area and allowing us to have housing safety regulations, tenant regulations that can address not just flooding, but all kinds of risks that can face people in their housing. So I know we'll get into more of that today, but just wanted to build on that.
Thanks for adding that additional color, Sylvia. I'm really excited to jump into some of the regulatory questions around basement apartments as well. Ryan, just wanted to give you the opportunity to share if you had any other insights that you wanted to add.
No, I think Jovan and Sylvia covered it really well. I think what's worth noting about this issue is that it's sort of a natural byproduct of just sort of overall system failure in New York City, right? The fact that we have unregulated basement apartments to begin with, right, is sort of this organic byproduct of the fact that you have, on one hand, low and moderate income homeowners who are struggling to keep up with the cost of home ownership. And on the other hand, this growing crisis of affordability for tenants, and basement apartments are this sort of unwarranted solution for both that has arisen somewhat naturally, right? But as Sylvia mentioned, they exist in this sort of gray area that's not sustainable, right? And you compound that with the fact that you have this increased risk of flooding, it becomes all the less sustainable. And so, this is really sort of systematic failure on display that really warrants increased attention.
I appreciate this, Ryan, and sort of leads me to my next question, which is really to sort of address systemically the experience of flooding as being sort of a byproduct of a systemic failure in basement apartments. Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, the organization that you work with, in coordination with HPD, developed a basement apartment conversion pilot program in East New York. Can you share a little bit about that program with us?
Certainly. Yeah, so Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, where I work, is in a sort of a unique experience with the question of basement apartments because, yes, we did lead the city's first attempt to confront this long neglected issue. And this was the East New York Basement Apartment Conversion Pilot Program, which launched in early 2019 in collaboration with HPD and other program partners. And this program was based exclusively in Brooklyn Community Board 5, which is the East New York Cypress Hills neighborhood of Brooklyn. And our task was to work with local homeowners to go through the process of bringing their basements into compliance with the existing rules and regulations on the books. And over the course of that process, identify the barriers and challenges to doing this at scale citywide, right? And this was an exciting sort of thing for us to lead because, in our community, we're a low and moderate income neighborhood. A lot of, we're largely defined by our small homeowners, right? And we have just a high concentration of these illegal basement apartments. And so, we were really sort of spearheading this city pilot initiative that was the first attempt to confront this issue that was all for decades out of sight, out of mind. And what I will say is that, in terms of identifying barriers, barriers we found, and we found barriers every which way. What we found was that it was virtually impossible to take a basement and bring it into compliance with the rules and regulations on the books. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit later in terms of recent regulatory reform. So I'd like to take just a minute or two just to run through a couple examples of types of barriers that we found. One of the first things that we found in terms of a challenge was in the local zoning law. So we did an assessment of nearly 250 homes just on the outside to see if they could meet basic physical regulatory requirements, things like parking. And this is parking requirements found in the city's zoning code. What we found was that around a third of the homes that we were considering were not viable. They were ineligible because of the city's parking requirements. If we were to add an additional unit to this property, in many cases, we would also have to add an additional off-street parking spot, not on the street, but on the actual property lot. Now, when we're talking about small homes, small lots, small properties, this was impossible for a large number of homes. And so right off the bat, we lost about a third of the homes that we were assessing, right? For a regulatory reason that has nothing to do with the health and safety of the basement, right? So zoning was one barrier. A second barrier we found was not zoning, but was in the building code, the city's building code, and this had to do with ceiling height. So we looked at about 100 basements, the interior, to see what can we do, what do we need to do to bring this into compliance with the various rules and regulations. And in that case, we found that about 90%, 90% of the homes that we assessed were ineligible or infeasible because they didn't meet the minimum ceiling height requirements. And this might just be a matter of a couple inches here and there, but because they didn't meet these required ceiling height requirements, disqualified. The third barrier we found was in the New York State multiple dwelling law. This is housing law that's set in Albany that pertains to properties with 3 or more units. So this really applies to existing 2-family homes looking to become a 3-family home, which is the majority of homes in communities like East New York and many others in the city, where if you were to convert from a 2 to a 3-family home, you would then become subject to New York State law that comes with a whole host of other rules and regulations that pertain to the entire property, not just the basement. And so to comply with this set of laws, you would have to do things, for example, adding rooftop access to your home, building a guardrail around the perimeter of your rooftop, things that were not just physically challenging in many cases, but also very expensive. And so this set of state level laws shrank our, number of viable projects virtually to 0. And so that is what we were able to accomplish in the pilot, was identifying these various sets of regulations that prevent willing homeowners to step forward and legalize their basements. And worth noting that in the midst of identifying these barriers, the night of September 1st, 2021, into the early morning hours of September 2nd, 2021, New York City is hit with the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida, which caused catastrophic flooding, and changed the narrative from that day forward around the risk and the urgent need to address this long neglected issue. The last thing I'll say is that when we launched the East New York pilot in 2019, we categorically excluded any properties that were within the coastal floodplain for the year 2100. So we were well aware that there's going to be some sections of the city where we're not looking to encourage basement apartments along the coastlines. But September 2021 is where the conversation really changed, and we discovered that amidst all of the regulatory challenges that we're already dealing with, we're now faced with this new dynamic of inland stormwater flooding.
Thanks for sharing all of the incredible challenges that you uncovered through the pilot program. And I know that these challenges are being addressed by coalitions that are trying to sort of shift the way that we're sort of exploring these regulatory issues. And Sylvia, would love for you to sort of share a little bit more about the Basement Apartments Safe for Everyone, or BASE Coalition, that was formed really to sort of push the legalization and safety of basement and cellar apartments in New York City. Can you tell us a little bit more about the BASE Coalition?
Sure, I'm happy to. And we'll say, of course, that Ryan and Jovan's organizations are both also part of the BASE Coalition, and a really important co-founding leading member of the BASE Coalition is Chaya CDC, based in Queens. Folks from Chaya couldn't be here today, but they're absolutely central to the leadership of this work. And everyone on the call should look into Chaya CDC if they're not familiar already. But I'll give a brief history. So before, I've been at Pratt Center and working with BASE Coalition for about 3.5 years. But the BASE Coalition really started around 2008, growing out of the on-the-ground organizing community services that Chaya was doing, and seeing, the challenges that basement residents were facing in their neighborhoods, and working with Pratt Center, as I mentioned, on this report called New York's Housing Underground that really illuminated this issue and found that basement apartments are an essential part of the city's affordable housing stock, but again, they're not legally recognized, right? So at that time, some of the biggest concerns that were facing tenants and homeowners was fire risk. And of course, the risks to tenants of not having a legal tenancy, and challenges that can come along with that. And so the BASE Coalition was formed really to highlight this issue and look at strategies to legalize basement apartments and move from an environment of prohibition, which was basically this kind of housing isn't allowed. So if we find that it's there, the city's only tool is basically to issue a vacate order and fine, right? So people living there could potentially lose their homes. Homeowners would, lose that revenue and be facing those fines. Or that essentially these units are existing in this gray area, right, without regulation. And so the idea was to move into a mode of regulation where, of course, the units that could be safely lived in and upgraded could be differentiated from those where maybe we could all agree the risks are too high. This doesn't make sense to be housing long term. So that fight has been going on more than 15 years. And as is so often the case, unfortunately, as Ryan mentioned, it was really the deaths of 11 New Yorkers in their basement apartments during Ida in 2021 that moved us into sort of the biggest regulatory reforms that we've seen, which, of course, before that, the number one policy and programmatic win was the East New York pilot, where we learned the kinds of changes, as a pilot is supposed to do, right? Showed us the kinds of changes that we would need to actually make these units safe. The other piece of this, of course, is that it's not just about regulation, right? It's about funding. And, the East New York pilot is a perfect example of that, is that when the city did budget cuts during COVID, it also really shrunk the efficacy of the program. So just to emphasize that BASE's demands have been both around regulatory reform and real robust investment in ensuring that these conversions happen in the communities that are at the front lines of climate change and the housing crisis, right? That these are focusing on the most vulnerable tenants and homeowners in immigrant and communities of color. So Ryan walked through, the issue with basement apartments is that I think people can understand that this is a housing safety issue that can come down to, hopefully not, but as we saw with Ida, can come down to life or death, comes down to the basic everyday affordability and stability of people's housing. But legalizing these apartments is not as simple as we've passed a law saying we legalize apartments. There's a really complex regulatory regime that shapes all of our housing. So we could talk for hours and hours and hours about what all of those are, but Ryan did a good job of giving a sense of them. I think the key point is that in 2024, at the beginning of the year, after a multi-year campaign, we did win state regulatory reforms that would allow the city to move forward with basement legalization in a number of neighborhoods. We did not win citywide regulations. We won what the state is calling a pilot again. I think in the view of base, others can weigh in, but we don't really need another pilot. We need to implement what we've learned. And at this point, make it, we see that the risks are evolving all the time. We need to make as many homes as safe as possible for as many vulnerable tenants and homeowners as possible. But what we won was reform to address these challenges in the state multiple dwelling law that Ryan referred to in 15 community districts. Unfortunately, of those districts, only 2 are those that, for instance, Pratt Center identified as having the highest concentration of unregulated units. And I would say, though we didn't have a lot of insight into how those 15 districts were chosen, it was sort of a mix of opposition and chaos. But we haven't found any sort of sound planning principles that guided the selection of those 15 districts. But nevertheless, and there's a 5-year window for people to apply to the program that the city would ultimately create. So big win with a lot of challenges. So at the same time as that campaign was moving forward, the city was proposing a number of the zoning reforms that were also identified as obstacles in the East New York pilot. Those ended up being passed as part of the larger City of Yes for Housing initiative. So through the combination of these reforms, we now have the pieces, many of the pieces that we need for the city to move forward with a program. We've begun to see them roll out the sort of agency rules. Those include things like the inland flood maps, because we know that this is an evolving risk and the city is working on defining those. We're waiting for sort of the most important basement rules to come out of the Department of Buildings, expecting them any day now. And so, but a ton of progress since where we started 15 years ago. But one of the biggest fights right now is, as I said, to really make sure that this program is designed and funded in a way that is accessible to the homeowners and tenants who need it most. Many of whom might be English language learners, have other reasons to be concerned about interfacing with the government right now. We also know that the city itself has to shift from an enforcement mindset into like bringing people into a program and trusting that people are doing that in good faith. So that's where we're at right now, a sort of big, exciting moment where things are finally gonna move forward. And it's really just about making sure that we're focusing on the most vulnerable communities. And I'll also just add that none of us see I shouldn't speak for all of you, but I believe I can say none of us see basement apartment legalization as a panacea, something that can work in isolation, right? As we talked about in the beginning, we know we need citywide infrastructure improvements to address flood risk. And we know that we need all kinds of strategies to expand the low-income housing stock and protect tenants. And all of our organizations work on those strategies in addition to our work on basement apartment legalization. So this is one piece of a way bigger puzzle.
I appreciate that comment very much, Sylvia. I think, some of the work that we're doing as Waterfront Alliance, we're also doing a lot of work around, climate resilience and flooding, reform, especially as we're sort of seeing, impacts to communities today. And would love to sort of get your thoughts, Jovan, Ryan, would love to sort of get your thoughts on how do we really ensure that basement housing reform is, more deeply embedded and is part of the broader climate justice and housing equity agenda. I think you sort of touched on it, Sylvia, like the importance of that intersection, but would love to sort of get your thoughts on how do we sort of broaden, the coalition here?
I would just say, just to keep it shortly, I pass it to Ryan. Is just stay engaged, follow up on these resources, and be proactive in this information. As we hear, policies do change, depending on impact or the growth of them. So the more you stay in touch with your local officials, especially members within here, there's a way of knowing how to capitalize on the coalition and how to protect not just yourself, but the community you live in and you're also serving.
Yeah, I would just echo that, and I think hopefully it's clear now that the issue of basement apartments on the surface is really pretty simple, right? In terms of like what's going on, but the solutions can be a little bit complicated, right? They require sort of reforms in different places, which means that you need to sort of get policymakers and elected officials in different places at different times, sort of working in unison to sort of cobble together an effective strategy. And so, yeah, just agreeing with Jovan. I mean, I think it's a matter of sort of staying engaged with policymakers, local elected officials, making sure that they're keeping this, not only keeping this a priority, but are also sort of, engaged with, some of the complexity, and they're clear on what the solutions need to be. Um, and yeah, I'm hopeful that we're sort of heading in that direction.
Sylvia, passing it to you if you have other insights that you'd like to share. Okay. Amazing. Would love to jump into our next question. And this one's for you, Jovan. So Paul, as we sort of understood here, the work has been going on for several years. And while these policy and regulatory sort of changes happen, what immediate actions can happen in the interim to reduce the risk of flooding in existing basement units, and also to reduce the risk of other sort of things like Sylvia mentioned fire as well. But what kinds of protections can tenants potentially have given the work that you do?
Absolutely. And before we dive in, I just definitely just want to just follow up on what Sylvia and Ryan was saying, because the information they were sharing earlier is crucial to education and awareness. And as policies are implemented and as well as pilot programs are launched, you may be asking yourself, especially after hearing this information today, um, where do we go from here? You may ask yourself, even prior to the conversation, why me? Now what? And even questions such as, I can barely afford my daily expenses. How could we afford to protect our homes and our property structure, regardless if you're a homeowner or you're a tenant in a property? And the simple answer is you reach out to us. We're here for you. This flooding can be not just basement flood, but flooding period can be really confusing, overwhelming, and also feel unfair at times. But I want to let everybody in the space know that you're not alone. It's not your fault. It's not too late to capitalize and mobilize on this information. And with that being said, just echoing again, education as well as being proactive is key to the resilience in this measure. When I go out to communities, and I engage with those throughout New York City. I let people know that I can't stop the flood, and I also can't stop the rain from occurring. But we do have information as well as programs available that are available today to make the most of it. Within our organization, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, we have programs such as Resilient Retrofits as well as Flood Help New York. Resilient Retrofits is a program as well as a way to protect your home from future flood damage, storm damage, as well as improve energy efficiency. We understand that basement flooding impacts is multi-layered and it's just not one-dimensional, and more expenses and construction and policy are involved that people may expect. And another thing that we see is that there could be a misconception based on what people are seeing online. Maybe something you heard from your neighbor, maybe something you researched, maybe something, a newsflash that came up that may scream to you, but you may not know how to protect yourself. So programs such as resilient retrofits is a way people can strengthen their property by receiving resiliency measures, especially towards their basement. Measures such as elevating your sump pump, because when it rains and floods, and then if your property is impacted by the rainfall and then mechanical is damage or involved, they can be really expensive to replace, as well as finding a contractor to do this work as well. So the program has resources as well as funding available today that you can receive resiliency measures, upgrading your mechanicals, elevating your mechanicals, improving your drainage, having sump pumps, even improving the materials and drainage that can lead into in your home, that can cause water to lead into your home. And we also have other programs such as Flood Help New York, which is providing resources to make informed decisions, understanding your risk as well as future floods about and ways, even ways to lower your insurance. We do know that flooding insurance can be complicated and confusing, but homeowners as well as tenants are eligible, depending on where they are and what's available to them, to receive insurance to protect themselves from flood damage as well. So these are just ways that you could just use our tools and resources to know how. And what's really important is for people to call us. We're going to drop the information later in the chat, but call 646-786-0888. We have a dedicated team of associates, as well as people that are familiar with this work that are ready to support you and get you enrolled to programs, as well as support you both property wise as well as emotionally. And understanding that there's confusion there, but we were really here to be a guiding hand in this matter. And once again, just capitalize and stay engaged with everybody in this room because we're all in this fight together and we're here for you through and through.
On your work is so critical and just you sharing here all of the immense sort of solutions and ways to sort of reduce risk for immediate flooding is really, really amazing and very much appreciate all of the work that you do, especially in the communities that you work with. I do have a follow-up question, and would love to sort of, if you can share a little bit more about the insurance part of especially basement apartments. I know that there's a lot of confusion about whether or not basement apartments can get particularly flood insurance. Can you share a little bit more about from what your experience has been?
You hit it perfectly. Confusing. It's confusing because some people have heard from maybe a loved one, a neighbor, or maybe the insurance company. They're not eligible for insurance. But the best way I could frame insurances right now is speak to people, for example, like housing counselors at Chaya or Cypress Hills, or even calling us so you can get in contact with a housing counselor who understand flood insurance, what that means to their property, and even help people receive affordable flood insurance. I know there's a lot of people here, so they may have a lot of different property structures or different ways of having homeowner insurance. But let's definitely speak to a housing counselor who specializes in flood insurance so you can know your risk, how much it will cost, and how to access flood insurance.
Thanks for sharing that. I very much appreciate it. We are about to turn to our last question that we have for our panelists here. But if there are questions from the audience, there's a few that are coming in. Please feel free to use the Q&A chat. We'd love to give you the time to have a conversation with our panelists as well. So as we close this part of our conversation, would love to sort of ask each of you, what's one action, whether it's policy, community-led, or technical, that you believe could be most immediately and meaningfully, what could essentially advance safety, equity, and resilience for basement apartment residents in New York City? Ryan, would love to start with you.
Um, I'm gonna call it one, but it's kind of one collection of things. So, as I laid out earlier, we went through the experience of the East New York pilot. We documented all the various challenges across different rules and regulations to doing this at scale in New York City. And then Sylvia mentioned how in the last year there have been some major wins in terms of regulatory reform across the different um, jurisdictions, whether zoning, building codes, state level law. But, it's still a matter of implementing these regulatory reforms in an effective program, right? The reforms are sort of the outlines of the thing, and then it is sort of in the city's hands to take these reforms and shape them into a program that's going to have real effect on the ground. And this is our shot right now to do it. And so, as Sylvia mentioned, we're still sort of waiting on the precise details of what this basement legalization program is going to look like. And it is just our hope that our policymakers at City Hall and the elected officials that hold them to account are really taking seriously this opportunity that we have to design a program that is accessible to the homeowners and tenants that need it most, and actually, lead to successful basement legalizations. And at the same time, it was also mentioned that this program is unfortunately limited in geographic scale. This was done at the state level when Albany passed its law last year, authorizing New York City to establish this pilot program. It was limited to 15 community districts. Now, there are 59 community districts in New York City, so we're talking about really just a quarter of the community districts in New York City are going to have access to this program, and that needs to change. That needs to be expanded to cover all of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in New York City, and that needs to be done at the state level. So I think we need to acknowledge the wins that we've had, right? But also acknowledge that there's more work to do in terms of designing an effective program that is available in every corner of the city that most needs it. And that's going to take ongoing policy work and advocacy.
I appreciate you also sharing that it needs to be done at the state level. I think that is really critical, and I think there's ways that the city, state, as well as local elected officials can all sort of work together to make sure that this program is successful. And I feel like that might be a critical next step. Sylvia, would love for you to share as well.
Yeah, ditto to everything Ryan said. I guess I would just highlight, right now, I think a big concern for base is what the tenant protections are going to be for tenants who are temporarily or permanently displaced from basement apartments. And I think, for all of us, this issue of climate displacement and how we are going to rehouse people safely, especially again, low income housing, which right now we don't know how to replace our affordable housing stock at the depth of affordability of what exists, right? So if we can't preserve existing low income housing and we have to find more housing for people, how are we going to do that? And the only way really is going to be that we all, in every corner of our work, commit to expanding tenants' rights and investments in low income housing. Also, in terms of the sort of more immediate term and the rollout for this program, would welcome any ideas, models people know of from other cities, other places about successful tenant relocation policies and programs. This is particularly going to be for any basement conversions that happen. There's this like patchwork of regulations that have been passed means that there will be some conversions that happen potentially without city funding, potentially in one-family homes outside of the pilot district, where there will be even fewer rights and resources that are built into the regulations and programs. So truly welcome creative ideas that people might have, and just people's support and advocacy for centering tenants at risk of displacement in this process, because whether it's basement apartments or other kinds of housing and neighborhood resiliency programs we're working on, this issue is going to continue to confront all of us, and we can't leave it as sort of an afterthought just because it's hard.
Jovan?
Yeah, Ryan and Sylvia hit it on perfectly. How I will follow up. So I would like to take a cheat code and say D, all of the above, because all of them matter, regardless how you show up to the work. But if I really had to pick one, I would go community led, in the sense that there's power in numbers. When more neighborhoods, more homeowners, tenants are aware of the resources that are available, that's how people can be proactive in the information and the support they receive. There are so many organizations such as ours that are open to go to the communities and let people know we exist. Because one thing that people I've seen in the line of work is a level of trust. When it comes to basement apartments and tenants in basement apartments, people are hesitant to ask for help because they feel like if they were to ask for help, there would be disadvantage because they may actually be in legal basement, but they need help. So at that point, just reach out to us, anybody in this room, let us know that there's a need here. Even if it's just not fix our home, can you just speak to the importance of this? Some people may feel like this would never impact them, maybe because they never seen flooding before, and maybe just be a far-fetched thing that you see on the news because they've never seen rainfall. But when there's one voice, there could be multiple voices that are just shy to come up. But then when one person steps up, then people could be more involved, and it could be more programs, and be more support, more policy that could go forth, because what really matters is the voice of the community. The people in New York City, voices matter. New York City is known to be bold, proud, aggressive, eager. But also one thing that people don't say with New Yorkers is that they're compassionate and they're neighborly. So when you really mobilize and you work with your community, that increases the need for programs, for policy, for pilots, and just ways for more people to get the assistance that they need, so they can stay in the communities, passing down for generations to come. And then from there, another level of resilience could come that's long overdue.
What a way to wrap up the question, Jovan. I really appreciate that. Um, we do have a couple of questions from the audience, but I did want to just sort of, before we jump in, say thank you. This was a really wonderful conversation in that it demonstrated the complexity of this issue. It's critical, actually. This last question was a really great way to sort of demonstrate how we need to be thinking about it at a systems level, right? There's policy and reforms that need to be taken into consideration, but then there's also tenant rights that need to be taken into consideration, and what are some of the implications of even of those policies and of those reforms if they change. And then finally, there's the immediacy of the flood risk, and what are some of the things that we need to be doing now. And really appreciated all three of you sort of highlighting all three issues very, very well, and articulating the really the complexity of basement apartments in New York City today. With that, I will jump into the first question, and please feel free to anyone to sort of jump in and share your response here. The question, while obviously basement legalization is a matter of life safety, is there any concern that legalization of informal housing might have the knock-on effect of locking out people who are living in basement apartments because they are shut out of the formal housing market, either financially or due to not meeting documentation requirements? sure who wants to take that one, but we'll pass it on to you.
I'll start. Yes, this concern obviously has been part of the conversation from the start, and I think, all of us, the idea of the base campaign is that it is a combination of community-based organizations that are talking to residents who are affected by this issue and researchers and policy advocates who take a community-based approach. And I think we've heard this concern and also heard from people about the very real safety and affordability risks that come from lack of regulation. And I think this is why we have been working so hard to try to center and strengthen the tenant protections as much as possible. And again, why one of the demands is to expand public investment for, forgivable low interest loans, financing for people to carry out these conversions, because I don't think we would consider it a success if what we saw was a bunch of landlords creating more expensive units that people can't return to. I don't think that's our goal. While also recognizing that, like, there probably will be some cases where that happens, right? But the goal here is to make housing safety for people who have the fewest options possible. And again, some of that might be through the regulations that are in the basement program itself, and some of it might be for, in the other work we do in other coalitions we're part of, advocating for stronger tenants' rights more broadly. So, not exactly a direct answer, but just to say, like, yes, it's a real hard challenge that we are not pretending isn't there, and trying to figure out the best way to address in our work.
Brian, Jovan, did you want to add?
I would just sort of echo that, and I think those of us who work on this issue are all aware, obviously, of its complexity and the different tensions that are at play. I think a lot of times we're always trying to sort of identify the balance between sort of competing um, dynamics. We want to be able to expand the opportunity for basement legalizations to as many homes as possible, but we don't want that to come at the expense of the health and safety of the unit or the stability of that unit for the tenant. And so it's a balancing act that I think we're all grappling with at all times. But I think we all begin with the simple premise that the status quo is unacceptable. And so it's up to the rest of us to figure out how we sort of, um, forge a more optimal policy path forward.
Wonderful. I'll jump to the next question. Given the gray areas people are living in and the time it takes for policy changes, since water doesn't wait, what should a renter do if afraid to challenge their landlord to fix things for fear of removal? It's a great question. Jovan, I think I might pass this one to you.
No, that's a great question. Let me read it again before I answer, because that's definitely a great one. Yeah, that's a great question. I would definitely say, once again, speak with us, because we can also help you navigate the sensitivity of this topic. We understand that affordable housing is not just a New York City or New York State issue, it's a United States issue. It's a countrywide issue, and there's so many complexities regarding illegal basements in New York City that people are hesitant to ask for assistance or reach out because that means they may lose their housing or affordable housing at that matter. So what tenants could do when they're afraid is speak with us. because this is a sensitive, and it can be a safe space as well as a sensitive way to know what your options are. There are tenant resources that also can help you navigate these conversations, as well as landlord-tenant mediators who can come in and speak on your behalf regarding these topics so that some type of reform could be done. And also, the landlord could be also incentivized to implement these programs as well as resources to protect their homes as well. One thing going back to the monetary impact is that it costs more money to fix your home once flooding has occurred, opposed to a landlord taking proactive measures to receive the assistance that they need to do the work. The best way I like to frame it is that um, if your basement were to be damaged for flooding, that's one, losing rental income, two, paying for the repairs, as well as three, now needing the construction needed to make your home, to strengthen your home. So we would like to save your money, save financial hardship, save emotional hardship, and let people incentivize people to capitalize on these matters. And once again, speak to Waterfront Alliance. Their resiliency measures are in their name. They are a dedicated team who knows where to go, who to speak to, and are looking out for New Yorkers, regardless where they live, how much they make, or what they're going through.
Thanks for the shout out, Jovan. I appreciate it. Um, we have time for one more question, and so I would love to, actually, this question is kind of related to the first one, so I would love to sort of jump into this one. Does this new legislation make provisions on how to identify existing affordable housing that people who may relocate can move to? Sylvia, and Ryan, given your sort of intimacy with the new legislation, would love your thoughts.
I'm just gonna let Ryan go because I've talked, but go.
Sure. I mean, short answer, no, the legislation doesn't explicitly, doesn't explicitly address, um, you know, uh, other affordable housing, for instance, that, existing tenants could, relocate to. The state level law that was passed last year does provide for the tenant's right to return to the unit once it has been legalized, but sort of the temporary relocation plan, um, is on policymakers to sort of flesh out.
Great. Sylvia, did you want to add? Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for the conversation today. Really appreciated you bringing your expertise and your lived experiences to this conversation. I think it's really critical that we're starting to, have these conversations in a broader sort of, as Sylvia sort of mentioned, in a more sort of climate justice oriented space, particularly during Climate Week. So very much appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today. And to the audience, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you joining us for the first day of Climate Week. And we encourage you all to join us again for our next set of webinars. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Climate Week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.